Chicago Bears Daily Fantasy Team Preview. I'm Jason Gilbo. With me is Russell Clay. Taking a look at a Chicago team that was very mediocre last year, dealt with a lot of injuries in the receiving core. Obviously, Kevin White missing his rookie season. Alshon Jeffrey was banged up quite a bit. Both presumably healthy coming into this year. You and I, fairly kind of not as optimistic. We're just kind of more, it's a meh situation for Chicago.
Yeah. There's upside. I will say that, especially with the running back situation, not a particular player for me, and with Kevin White coming into his second year, obviously coming off a nothing year one where he didn't really get any snaps or play at all because of the injury. So there's a lot of upside. I'm willing to be pleasantly surprised with that, but there's also just beyond, if Kevin White isn't a ready product and Alshon Jeffrey continues with these injuries, I think this could be a bottom 5 offense in the league if that continues. So I think that's something to be aware of. And if White or Jeffrey goes out, it's not going to be like a lot of other teams where there's some guy who steps in and you're kind of like, well, he was super productive in college, or, well, they drafted him a few years ago, like a Cody Latimer or something. It's like, no, there's just nothing. Eddie Royal's hurt right now. There's just nothing. So we have to take that into account. And I mean, a lot of DFS is sort of evaluating those injuries, especially by midseason and later. Who's going to emerge? Potentially no one. It's just not a lot of points.
It's true. I mean, there really is not anything below Jeffrey or White on the depth chart. I mean, you have Marquise Wilson, who is basically an average wideout in a bad situation, because at this point in Cutler's career, I mean, he's average at best. He doesn't make wide receivers better. So it's not like this point where, you do have people coming in, but he's not playing with the Drew Brees, he's not playing with the Tom Brady, where they do come in for injuries and they're instantly productive because they're in such a great offense and because they're in such a great spot. That's not the case here with Chicago.
And there's a few different tiers to quarterbacks. There's ones who elevate their receivers to be better than they are. There's ones much like what?
I just said that.
No, I know. I'm giving the breakdown, and I said where Cutler falls is that he's just kind of this average, doesn't really elevate their players, but if they are good, then he can provide sort of that nice floor for them. And then there's quarterbacks that are just bad. Cutler is not a bad quarterback, but we do know what he is at this stage in his career. So we've seen him support good receivers before. I think Jeffrey can be that. I think we've seen him support two fantasy relevant receivers before. So I think White and Jeffrey can be good, especially on a week-to-week basis. But as far as Cutler goes in a fantasy sense, like you mentioned, we've seen what he is. We know what he is. He's going to get hurt some games. He's going to have 5 interception games. But overall, he's going to have some good weeks too. So I mostly avoid Cutler. I don't like having those potential down weeks looming over me whenever he's in my lineups. But at the same time, he's always an interesting tournament guy.
Yeah, because he's always so cheap and because you can pair him up with a top-tier wide receiver like Jeffrey and maybe like White becomes. It's obviously a nice kind of stacking potential duo. But I'm in agreement. It's not something I jump all over on a week-to-week basis. Mm-hmm. The Bears have lost a lot of targets are gone. Martellus Bennett, obviously he was banged up a little bit last year. His 86 targets are gone. Forte's 59 targets out of the backfield are gone. They didn't replace anyone. Zach Miller is just stepping up, and if you played last year, Zach Miller was a viable value option for a few weeks there. This year, I don't expect a ton of production out of him. On occasion in great matchups, maybe I'll take a look. This passing game is much more focused on basically 2 wide receivers, and that's about it.
So remember when the Colts drafted Philip Dorsett, and we already broke down the Colts, but it was like, oh, why'd they do that? I kind of wish like the Bears would like think about doing something like that, where it's like, oh, well, maybe you guys need some depth here. Let's grab a wide receiver at some point. So, yeah. As far as the tight end goes, I think Zach Miller's going to be a stable type of receiving tight end, like you mentioned, but it's not going to be crazy. I don't think he's going to continue on that pace that he did set at the end of last year. So it's just going to be mediocrity, in my opinion. And I guess we can jump to the running game. Regardless of how you feel about Jeremy Langford, which I don't think either of us are high on him, he is the starting running back heading into the year. They did actually draft him. He's not an undrafted free agent, so that's positive. He did get significant volume in quite a few games last year. He was pretty solid in the receiving game. So, I mean, he's all right. Like, in good spots, I'm not going to be afraid to throw him in a tournament or something like that, you know. But overall, it's ugly. You know, Jordan Howard's sitting there. Kadeem Carey is someone that not a lot of people are talking about, but he could really be a guy I could see emerging as a third down back and sort of playing that type of role. And especially if Langford goes out, I could see him jumping into something. But, yeah, overall, it's kind of just a mess.
Yeah, I mean, I know you and I are both not very high on Langford. And for the sample size that we saw from last year, I mean, 3.6 yards per carry. He only caught 22 out of 42 targets, not very efficient. You're obviously throwing him into a possible larger volume. And as you mentioned, there are some potential guys who could steal some carries away from him. Jordan Howard being one of those guys. Kadeem Carey has been there for a couple of years now, hasn't really made a ton of noise. A guy out of Arizona. For me, this backfield is something I don't really probably am not going to look on most weeks just because of a lot of the averages that is there. I would like Langford to be good because I think it would really help out the offense. I just have a hard time buying into the fact that it's going to be efficient enough to the point where they actually stick with it. And even though John Fox is there and he is a run-heavy coach, I don't know. I mean, why stick with something that doesn't work? But maybe it's just a guy who maybe John Fox does stick with it because that's just how he's always known.
Yeah, and again, volume does rule the fantasy land for running backs, but if he gets off to a bad start, I think we should have learned over the years that yes, fantasy situation is important, but if the players just aren't good, teams are going to give up on them, especially if they don't have a big investment. So Langford, I'm not saying he has a short leash, but if he doesn't succeed in those first 3 to 4 weeks, they're going to start looking for other stuff. So be aware of that. But again, if he holds on to that role, I'm okay with him in some tournament situations.
Do you see Howard as possibly being a red zone back for Chicago?
Yes, but I don't see him being this juggernaut that's going to come in and steal Jeremy Langford's spot either. And I know you're not saying that, but I see a lot of Jordan Howard hype, and that doesn't necessarily make sense to me either. I think he is definitely a rotational guy, but he's not someone to come in and really blow the doors off of anything, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that, but I think I mean, let's talk about Langford. I mean, if he gets down and is a guy who I do think he's going to rely on touchdowns to make up for his fantasy potential. Mm-hmm. And if he gets into the red zone, Howard does coming in. So it takes a long time for Langford to get down there. It takes, 42 yards, 50 yards in a game. And you're hoping he just gets that touchdown to kind of put him over the edge and Howard comes in and sneaks it away.
Oh, well, yeah.
Both of them are just trash coming into the week because they both got you 7-8 fantasy points and that's it. Right.
Yeah. Realistically speaking, that's what I see coming down the pipe here, with Carey sneaking in some carries too. So it's just, I don't know. Nobody knows right now, but I think that's something you're just going to have to monitor closely week to week. And luckily with DFS, we're safe.
Yeah, definitely. And as far as kind of looking to strength of schedule here, the entire NFC North is fairly favorable. Chicago with the 30th easiest schedule, third easiest schedule. I don't think it's going to help him out of a ton, but as you mentioned, there is some upside with this team. That's where that's going to come into play is when you take a look at those NFC East games and facing those defenses, that's where a Jeffrey could bust out. That's where a White could bust out, or you could use kind of a cheap Jay Cutler.
Absolutely.
So as far as the defense goes, I mean, obviously this team definitely improved in 2015. They weren't that easy pick on team like they were the year before, but I still think they're a middle of the road defense. But they're not quite the you line up every offense against them and just kind of churn out points like they did before.
Right, exactly.
So that's going to wrap it up with the Chicago breakdown here. Be sure to check out our other teams at dailyfantasycafe.com.